No Hothouse Flowers by Lisa Doge. And I'm going to hold up my non-hothouse flowers. No hothouse flowers, these. Bred for perfection, dyed and trimmed and arranged to order, clothed in ribbons and bows. Not these. No, these are hardy, raw, and wild. Grown under the sky, they've weathered the wind and the rain and the heat. These drew nutrients from the neighborhood soil and energy from the sun. These survived pests and disease. These grow where they are planted, either by loving hands or the whims of birds or the caprice of the breeze. These have petals washed by dew, glowing with the colors of the hills and the sea and the prairies and the rocks. Their delicate perfume carries in it the fragrance of earth. No, not perfect, these. Only holy, a blessing to the eye, the heart, the soul. No hothouse flowers. We humans were not designed to be hothouse flowers or greenhouse flowers. For those of you who didn't used to know what hothouse meant, we are not designed to live our lives under a greenhouse. I think that's part of why, though, every one of us seeks out ideal conditions for our lives. We seek out the best friendships and relationships and jobs and schools, the best places to live. We find that we are made more resilient not by these ideal conditions, but by the difficult moments in our lives, by the difficult moments in the historical uh, experience we're having. I think we're not meant to be hothouse flowers, and I think that's part of why we're all so frustrated about being cooped up at home during COVID-19. We're not meant to be in a temperature controlled space, only seeing the outside world through glass, despite the fact that I preached about this earlier in the COVID outbreak. What I think is that greenhouses can give us a good start to life, but that real living happens under the wide open sky. And I've been thinking a lot this week about greenhouses as a metaphor for this moment, for greenhouses being a metaphor for systemic privilege in our world, whether that's race privilege or gender or class or educational privilege, even privilege of being a citizen of the United States. Because greenhouses both protect and create ideal conditions for thriving. Ideally, all of us would have those ideal conditions, but they also separate the inside from the outside. Well, think about greenhouses. In greenhouses, water is piped in. The sun is received in the greenhouse sometimes, but sometimes if the sun is too harsh, there's a cloudy row cover that's put over the flowers, or sometimes they're grown under lights. Specialized nutrients are used in the hothouse, in the greenhouse, designed for the biggest blooms. You never really feel the fullness of a storm inside a greenhouse. And inside the greenhouse, the gardeners are there to help you. They help to prop you up when you find that your stem is not strong enough to fully stand up by yourself. They're there to help make your ideal conditions exist for you. They protect you from pests. The gardener is your friend inside the greenhouse. And in the wild, it's completely different. Survival means something totally different in the wild. In the wild, survival is not about a trusting relationship with the gardener. Survival is about taking what the sun has to give you, taking the rain when it comes and the drought when it comes. It's about taking the nutrients where they exist in the soil and digging your roots down deep to be able to find what you need. Stems are stronger in the wild because they're used to those storms. They're used to the wind. And the gardener is different in the wild. The gardener is there to keep you in line in the wild. Sometimes that's by trampling you. Sometimes that's by uprooting you. Sometimes it's by spraying you with Roundup. We're not meant to be hothouse flowers, and I believe that anything that permanently shields us from the real world, with all of its weather and whim and droughts and deluges and sun and shadows, anything that shields us from the real world might make it seem like we are thriving. Our blossoms might be big and vibrant, but it keeps us from being fully resilient. And I would say that it keeps us from being fully human, to be shielded from the real world. Any system that is designed for the thriving of some at the expense of others keeps us from living into the promise of an integrated, united human community where all are invited into their own wholeness. And that's the core of our faith, my friends, is to be this united and equitable human community joined together as one. So I think part of what is happening right now, when I think about my experience of what's happening right now with the racial justice movement really taking the lead in the public dialogue right now, I think part of what is happening is that some of those panes of glass on the greenhouse are being removed. It feels like those of us who are inside, and I count myself in this particular analogy as someone who was on the inside because of my white skin, that those of us who've been shielded by our privilege are beginning to experience some of the storm. We're beginning to see that the gardener who has helped us so much has another nature as well on the outside of the greenhouse. And we are awakening to something that we've never truly understood before. And so those of us who are inside the greenhouse are reckoning with the realization that we haven't actually been outside in the real world this whole time, even though we thought that we were. Some of us are bewildered that the gardeners that are so helpful to us can be so harmful to others. And I think all of us who've been on the inside of the greenhouse are trying to rapidly adjust to that wind that we've never felt, that sun that we've seen but has never really touched our leaves with all of its strength and singeing power. We're trying to adjust to the rain that comes at the whims of Mother Nature rather than in our predetermined and perfect intervals. Those of us who've been inside the greenhouse are doing what gardeners call hardening off. So this is something that if you're a gardener, and my partner Kai and I did this with our tomato seedlings earlier a couple of months ago, if you start plants inside, either in a greenhouse or just inside under lights, in order for them to survive on the outside, they have to do what's called hardening off, which means that you bring them outside and you put them in the shade for a couple of hours, and then you take them back in. And then the next day you bring them outside and you leave them in the shade for a few more hours, and then you bring them back in. And then the next day you put them in a sort of partial sun, partial shade area for a little bit longer, and you see how they do. And then you bring them back in. And you expand their exposure to the real world a little bit by little bit until over a week or so, they finally can make it overnight outside, experiencing the wind and the rain and the pests as best they can after having a sheltered experience at the beginning of their life. And so I think a lot of us are feeling that experience of being hardened off, and it is not a comfortable experience. It's intentionally building our resilience bit by bit, but not through comfort, through exposure to what is real. And so what's happening right now is that we're experiencing the real weather and the hardships of the world. And we're starting with short periods and trying to work up to being comfortable being in the real world all the time. those of us who've been inside the greenhouse. And the gift that comes from this is that we will be moving from a fragile place to a resilient place. When the greenhouse comes down, life in the garden is very, very different, especially for those who were inside. Actually, no, it's not. It's different for everybody. Because instead of competing for the most perfect single bloom on the inside, we grow together in masses, in community, holding each other's narrow stems up like a group of larkspur growing together in a pile so that they can hold each other up rather than one specific rose plant. We grow in masses, we grow in community. We find our beauty not in one fleeting, perfect moment of bloom, but in an ever-changing landscape of color and greenery where some rise and then fall and others rise and fall, and the whole garden itself maintains its beauty the whole time. The role of the gardener when we are all outside is to tend to the whole. It's to help do what's called companion planting, where roses are planted with garlic because both thrive when they are next to each other, where tomatoes are planted with marigolds because both will do better when they are in relationship with one another. The gardener's job is to encourage companion planting and to put compost down for everybody rather than specified nutrients to make just a couple of blooms extra perfect. There are lots of greenhouses in this world. I think most of us have experienced ourselves on the inside of some greenhouses and on the outside of others. And sometimes greenhouses are a state of emotional well-being, not just a state of societal privilege and oppression. But what we know is that those who have been on the outside of greenhouses have been trampled too long. And what we know is that those who have been on the inside of greenhouses have been shielded from reality for too long. And while the hothouse or the greenhouse is a good place to begin, it's no way of really living. So on this flower communion, as we're reflecting on beauty and resilience, as voices for justice in the world call for the greenhouses to come down and for us to see one another clearly, join together in massed planting and in companion planting. May those of us who need to harden off grow resilient. May those of us who've been trampled find peace and an ability to thrive anew. May the role of the gardener transform to tending to the whole. And may we find, as we grow alongside these new, unlikely companions, a new strength, a new understanding of beauty, a new ability to thrive together under open sky, and an ability to withstand the storms that are to come. My friends, may we run with the weeds. May we flourish for the field in the name of love, because we, you, all of us are not hothouse flowers. We are not bred for perfection, dyed and trimmed, arranged to order, clothed in ribbons or bows. No, not perfect are we, only holy, a blessing to the eye and the heart and the soul. May it be so, and amen.